Welcome, 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 everybody. We are so excited to have you all. We see people chiming in the chat. Please feel free to keep that going. Welcome to session 3 of our Demystifying TBP series. This session is called How Do We Approach Risk and Due Diligence in Trust-Based Philanthropy? I'm Shantia Spord, the Director of Programs here at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, and I'm so excited to be here with you all. I currently reside on Lenni Lenape Native land, which is also known as Philadelphia, for my native land acknowledgement. And for a physical descriptor, I am a Black woman with my lucky red lip, those who know. And I have Black hair, shoulder length hair, and I am sitting in front of a white wall with some diplomas, some artwork, and some plants on it. So excited to have you all here with us. Thank you for joining. Just a little bit of meeting housekeeping. Please do keep your microphones muted so as not to disturb or interrupt our sessions as they go along. Of course, you already are doing it, but please continue to use the chat box for comments, questions, and dialogue. We see it, the speakers see it, staff will be in there responding to you all. We'll try to keep that engagement going. And I know there are a lot of people here, so hopefully it's a chance for you to engage with each other as well as we collectively learn and share together. Please do ensure that you're using the most recent version of Zoom for the breakouts, for the discussion. If you want to drop some emojis in there, we love all of that. Of course, for accessibility, live transcription is available for this event. To enable live captioning, please navigate to the meeting's control toolbar and click the show captions icon. And this session will be recorded for future reference. We'll be sharing it out in an email, and we'll also have it up on our website for you all. And of course, please join us on our social media using the hashtag DemystifyingTBP. We have our lovely comm staff that will be live tweeting and we'll be sharing insights on LinkedIn. And please feel free to join us with your insights, your pool quotes, all of your great reactions and thoughts. And speaking of lovely staff, of course, have to give a wonderful shout out to the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project staff. This is an all-team effort, and you'll see staff members in the chat. You'll see us supporting in different ways. So shout out to the team, and thank you all for your continued support and help. If you have any questions, if you need anything, reach out to any of these lovely faces, and we'll be happy to help you all. Jumping into the series outline, for those of you, maybe this is your first session in the series, maybe you've been to all of them. We're so glad to have you either way. And this conversation will be on how do we approach risk and due diligence and trust-based philanthropy. And just as a reminder, this series is about demystifying TBP. It's about the questions that we get from you all, the things you all are grappling with. We've heard you, we hear the confusion or just wanting more examples, wanting more information. And so we designed this series to really reflect and to get at the questions and the different things that people are grappling with as you all are trying to adopt trust-based practices and just the spirit of trust-based philanthropy in your work. And so we'll get to risk and due diligence today. We're really excited for this conversation. And you can see the rest of the series. You can also see our previous sessions. They're up on our website, available for you to look at the recordings. But after this, we'll be talking about grantee accountability. We get a lot of questions on that. We'll be talking about evaluation, learning and evaluation. We know we get a lot of questions on how do we evaluate, how do we know our impact in a trust-based practice. So we'll be talking about that in July, and then we'll be closing out this series as we know it, on racial equity, talking about the correlation between racial equity and trust-based philanthropy. And so feel free to come to all of these events. We look forward to continuing to see you in these sessions. So jumping into today's agenda, we're having our opening right now. We'll have a little bit of grounding context. We realize that people are coming in at different levels in their journey, both in their trust-based journey and also in philanthropy in general. We've had quite a few newcomers. And of course, we also have people that have been in the sector, in the field, in this work for a long time. And so we're going to learn from each other. But of course, we want to set some grounding context so that everybody can come in with a base level understanding of the work that we're talking about. And then we have some amazing panelists that we're so excited to have here with us to share about their journey and their work. And then we're going to have some breakout discussions. We have multiple PSO partners who I'll just get to in a moment. These discussions are open to everybody. And we encourage you to stay on and to have these discussions to reflect on what you've learned, to think about how you're going to apply that to your work. So there's some discussion questions. There's some opportunities to connect with each other. So speaking of our amazing speakers, you'll hear from them in just a moment. We have Stacy Fiella, the Executive Director at the Woodcock Foundation. We have Shruti Jayaraman, Chief Investments Officer at Chicago Beyond. I guess I should probably make my font bigger so I can read. And then we have Minor Velez, the Chief Financial Officer at the Headwaters Foundation. So we're so excited to have each of these speakers to talk about their journeys and their work in this process. And as I mentioned, we have some amazing PSO partners, philanthropy serving organizations who have been partnering with us, sharing this series with their members, getting the word out, and they'll be leading their own PSO breakouts at the end of this session. Please feel free to join, even if you're not active. If you see a regional-based PSO that maybe you're not a part of, but you're in that region, please feel free to join them. And you'll have the opportunity to join these breakouts at the end of this session. So, yeah. So that's enough of the opening context. Thank you for hanging with me for that part of that. Now we're going to jump into an opening poll. And this is just the opportunity to do a gut check, to think about where you sit with this question. As we said, we designed these sessions. Let me launch the poll. We designed these sessions to be reflective of the common questions that we get from funders all over. And so we love to hear from you. How confident are you that you can answer this question? How do we approach risk and due diligence in trust-based philanthropy? Maybe you're very confident and you could answer this question in great detail. Maybe you have an idea of some of the things you could do to, some of the things you could say to answer this question, some of the ways that you can reframe risk or shift your due diligence process. Or maybe you're not confident at all and you have no idea how to answer that question or where to start. Wherever you sit in this, in these answers, you're in the right place. So I see quite a few people responding to the poll. I'll leave it up for just a second more, but I'm seeing in general, most people are saying somewhat confident. We have about 58% that are saying somewhat confident. About 40% are saying not confident, and about 3% are saying very confident. Excited to have you all either way. And I will go ahead and end this poll and share the results so you all can see. So yeah, hopefully by the end of the session, we're going to take this poll again, and hopefully by the end, we'll have quite a few more that are in that first category of being more confident on how to speak to this. Thank you for participating in that poll. So now we're going to go ahead and jump into some grounding context. And we like to just add this, as I mentioned before. Close the poll. We like to add this, as I mentioned before, just to make sure everybody's on the same playing field, so to speak, on the same level. We understand people are new to philanthropy and some have been in it for a while. So I want to start out with what is due diligence, because I know some people may not even have an idea of what that is. And what due diligence really is the funder-conducted data collection and assessment process that we see in philanthropy, to really determine the grant status, the grant award. Are you even accepting the grant? Are you approving it? So this is this process that funders conduct to determine what happens. So this is the process of collecting data and assessing it, analyzing it, asking questions, and there are multiple different types of data collection processes that come into place that I'll get into in just a moment. We do want to acknowledge the note about language. This terminology is rooted in the capitalistic culture. We acknowledge that. And conventional due diligence is really informed by the business sector, the finance, and the legal sectors. And so we acknowledge the origins of that as well, and some of that that's still at play in the ways that philanthropy operates. And this question really gets at risk when we think about it. When we hear this question coming from funders asking trust-based philanthropy, how do I do this due diligence process? What they're really asking is, how do I assess my risk in engaging with this nonprofit and engaging with this grantee? How do I gauge and manage risk in a trust-based manner? And so oftentimes it's connected to concerns around risky investments, around potentially funding institutions that may not be responsible or financially sound or different things like that, or may not deliver on their promises. So that's what the due diligence process gets to. And there are a lot of different components that funders look at when they're assessing their due diligence. They're looking at a nonprofit or a potential grantee's mission and impact. And is there alignment there? Is there alignment in what we as a funder are looking to do and what the nonprofit is already doing? And what impact are they already achieving? What impact can they achieve? And how can our support continue to bolster that? The due diligence process also looks at leadership. It looks at staff. It looks at the human capital side of things. And do they have the human capacity and capital to get the work done in a meaningful way? Do they have the right people on their team? It looks at that process. And again, this is me laying out the conventional due diligence process. This is what it typically looks like. Of course, there is some variation between funders, foundations, but this is oftentimes what it looks like this in one way or another. Of course, legal compliance. There are certain legal variations. Are you a 501c3? Do you have the legal requirements necessary for us to fund you? And what does that look like? Financial health. What does your budget look like? What do your reserves look like? The due diligence process really looks at an organization's financial health, where there are gaps, where there are needs, does their budget look reasonable, things like that. And then reputation is another one that comes up a lot. What do we know about this organization? What have we heard? If we connect with this nonprofit organization, will that affect our reputation any? Oftentimes funders are looking at that and considering that as well. So conventional due diligence can perpetuate inequity. The things that we've often been told are red flags, oftentimes are assumptions, and oftentimes can perpetuate inequity. It may not be as risky. And so we're going to get to that in a moment. You're going to hear a lot about this from the panelists, but this is an opportunity for you to reflect on your process and how it may be perpetuating inequity. And how we have a lot of limited views and thoughts around risk and what are bad grants and what are risky grants. So we'll be talking about that. To get to the question that we often get asked, there is a due diligence process and a trust-based approach. We are not advocating for funders to just throw money with no diligence, with no research. We're not advocating for that. We are advocating for funders to do things and to be responsible stewards. And of course, we have to think about responsible both to your donors, to your board, to your leadership, but also and primarily responsible to the nonprofits and the communities that you're aiming to serve. So just a few bullet points. This is just meant to be an overview. A trust-based due diligence process should lead with values alignment. You should be looking at what your values are as an organization and what your nonprofit, the grantee partners' values are, and where there's alignment there. Where can you support their work in a value-aligned way? We also encourage you to streamline those application requirements. Of course, your application is the way you collect that due diligence, but oftentimes a lot of the things we're asking for, we can do the homework, which is one of the trust-based practices. We can do the homework to collect that information for ourselves rather than asking our nonprofits about it. We can be proactive about it. And we also need to assess what things we're actually utilizing for our decision-making and which things we're just collecting and just sitting on. Oftentimes when it comes to the due diligence process, we as funders come in a scrutinizing manner, and we're looking for reasons not to support. We're looking at deficits. We're looking at the financials and looking for any holes or any gaps or any issues. And a trust-based process would encourage you to assess for ways to support, to assess with an asset mind, to assess the organization holistically, have these conversations, being relationship-centric. And of course, we also encourage you to take on the onus of the burden, take on the onus both in the process. So as I mentioned, doing the homework, figuring out which things you can collect for yourselves, but then also in how you respond to risk, understanding that a risk to you may be a hit, but it may not be as significant of a hit for you as a funder than it would be for the nonprofit partners. And then we also encourage you to question and test your assumptions. So does this red flag, is it really a red flag? And what would that mean for your work if you were to fund them? And then, of course, we encourage you to consider mutual risk. We think about risk and we think about the risk to the funder. What if we give this $10,000 grant and then the organization goes under? Yes, that can be risky, but it's more risky to the nonprofits. And so we encourage you to also just think about reciprocal risk, think about what risks are happening to the nonprofits. And just as funders have certain risks, nonprofits do as well. Engaging with certain funders, they can have the risk of being shifted off of the mission and the vision that they truly have because of funder push and funder desires. They have the risk of reputation issues. They have the risk of time and capacity issues if a funder requires them to do a lot of things that are taking them away from their meaningful work. So there are also a lot of risks to nonprofits engaging with specific funders. And so we encourage you to consider mutual risk as well. This is a two-way relationship, and it's important to consider that in a trust-based practice. So to quickly just skim through these, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I really want y'all to get to the panelist portion of this, but there are quite a few, and these are just a few examples of risk myths and a trust-based response to them. So one myth we may see, one risk flag we may see are questionable financials, whether that's low reserves or not a diversified set of funders or funding sources, different things like that that may come up in a financial review. And the myth we adhere to that is that, oh, they're questionable financials, so these are bad stewards of their finances and they're not fiscally responsible. They don't have the capacity to support the grant that we want to give them, so we shouldn't fund them. That's a myth. And so a more trust-based approach would be to get curious, to have discussions, to understand more about the financial gaps or inconsistencies, and consider other types of support to really strengthen their capacity. That gets to support beyond the check that we talk about in our practices. Another risk myth that we see a lot in philanthropy, high staff turnover. We use that as a flag all the time, and we say, oh, there's a lack of organizational health and capacity to really ensure grant requirements will be met. This is concerning. And a trust-based response would say, let's talk to them. Let's consider what rationale there may be for turnover and how can we engage with them and support their work to build their capacity and support to ensure there's not as much staff turnover. Another one is application errors or inconsistencies. And we often see that red flag, quote unquote, and say, oh, this is a lack of staff competence. They're not able to effectively manage internal operations and programming. And we encourage you to think about in a trust-based response, making space for dialogue to understand the organization's vision and collaboratively clarify certain issues. Maybe there's a language barrier, maybe there's a capacity barrier. There are all sorts of reasons for that. And if you immediately flag it and shut it down, then that limits that. So these are just some of the ways that you can shift and reframe how you're looking at risk. So with that, I know that was a lot for grounding context, and I know you all have a lot of questions. And your panelists, I'm going to invite them up right now with Shadi to really lead in this discussion where we're going to talk about this in more detail. You'll get more hands-on examples of how to really do this in practice. And with that, I will pass it over to Shadi and the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shantias, for that really wonderful and thorough overview. I think that provides really solid grounding for us to engage in discussion with our panelists today. So I'm delighted to welcome up Shruti Jayaraman, who is the Chief Investments Officer at Chicago Beyond, Minor Valise, Chief Financial Officer at Headwaters Foundation, and Stacy Fiala, Executive Director of the Woodcock Foundation. Welcome to our amazing panelists. And hello, everyone. I am Shadi Salehi. I am the Executive Director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. I'm joining you from Ohlone Land, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. I am an Iranian woman with pale olive skin and long brown hair with some art behind me and a spiky plant to my side. And just so pleased to welcome this panel discussion. And when we started planning this particular session, part of this series, there were some wonderings about whether this would be a hot enough topic to invite in a group of participants, but here we are at over 500 participants here, really curious to dig in. And I think Shantias really laid really solid groundwork for us as to why we're all here, because a lot of the conventional approaches to due diligence and risk are really steeped in a lot of financial and kind of legal terminology, and it doesn't make a lot of space for relational and trust-based approaches. So we're really here to feature the perspectives and experiences of leaders who have leaned into trust-based values to still do really great due diligence processes, but in a very different way. So we also handpicked the panel discussion for today because we have 3 complementary perspectives that will add a really well-rounded view of how we think about due diligence and risk in a trust-based context. So just for a little bit of context, and then I'll bring in our panelists to share their perspectives. But I wanted to note that we have Chicago Beyond and Headwaters Foundation, which were kind of built with trust-based values from the ground up. And so a lot of the processes around due diligence and risk assessment were kind of built in a trust-based way from the beginning. However, these are 2 very different organizations. One is a family foundation, one is a health conversion foundation, granting in very different ways in issue areas, however, leaning onto a lot of the same shared values. And then, of course, Stacy Fiala here representing a family foundation that has made transitions shifting toward a trust-based approach. So we'll be hearing perspectives of what it's like to build systems with these values at the core, what it's like to transition systems. And also we have a lot of really fabulous kind of perspective from a legal background to a financial background to a psychology background to really add some depth to how we think about this. So just to start out, I would love to just hear from each of you to share a little bit of a deeper context about your foundation. And let's start with this question of risk, because as Shantias has laid out, a lot of due diligence is really around assessing and managing and preventing risk. So let's start with that very important question of how to even think about this. And so Shruti, why don't we start with you, really just kind of give us some grounding, share a little bit about your work at Chicago Beyond, and how do you think about risk at your work at Chicago Beyond?
Thank you, Shadi. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Shruti Jayaraman, and our organization is Chicago Beyond. I have brown skin. I am wearing a denim dress. I have black hair that will not be tamed no matter what I do. Behind me is black acoustic foam because I am sitting in the recording studio of Chicago Beyond's community space. So we are a community member and a funder dedicated to freedom, founded by former high school principal Liz Dozier with funding support from Kimbra and Mark Walter. And Shadi mentioned some facts and figures might be helpful. So we just turned 7 years old and we've invested $47 million in that time. One vein of our work is responsive and seed funding. And the other vein, which is most of what we do, is bigger multi-year partnerships driving systems change. So think 6-7 figure dollar investments in work led by people whose personal experience has brought them to conviction in what they're doing. We fund across issue areas. So everything from the Chicago Southside Birth Center, which is led by Black midwife Janine Valerie Logan, who has changed policy and is now building a freestanding clinic, to Life After Justice, which is working nationally to end wrongful convictions led by people who've been exonerated. Across all this work, Chicago Beyond has really seen what can happen when people who have not previously had access to significant funding have the space to realize their visions. It's a beautiful thing, and that's part of why I'm so excited to talk about diligence and risk, which are on the path to get there. Also related to our risk topic, as Shadi mentioned, I used to be a lawyer, a finance attorney specifically, and I think sitting in many different seats really helps me see some different perspectives. So how do we think about the notion of risk? Both Shantias and Shadi touched on the history of this, right? Where do our notions of risk come from? And I start there only because I think we sometimes find ourselves like very dutifully carrying suitcases around of best practices without first having kind of unpacked what's in them. And it makes it really hard, right? We suddenly find ourselves like, why does it feel like it's so hard to fund the things we want to fund? There's a real history to that. Some of this banking and university and business culture that we've inherited, there really is an attitude towards protect the money, protect the reputation, shift the risk when you can away from the institution. And so we see a lot of that continuing to show up in funder practice where even though we may not be trying to build a fortress around the money, some of those practices are actually designed to do that, right? We may not be intentionally wanting to shift risk from the funder to the grantee, but actually some of these practices are designed to protect the institution and make the other party more precarious. And so we can't just carry around the suitcase because we make it so hard for ourselves. But I think our notions of risk here at Chicago Beyond, it's really about being intentional about it. It's neither this, risk is bad, avoid it, nor, as Shantia said in the introduction, is it this, we're trust-based, so we all hold hands and close our eyes and pretend there is no risk. But it's 4 things, it's avoid bad risk, which is, be very conscious of illegal activity, wasting funds, embrace good risk. So we want to take the risk of supporting work that could drive transformative change, right? That's why Chicago Beyond exists. Third, mitigating controllable risk. So if there's risk that relates to the success of the work that's within Chicago Beyond's control, we want to know about it. We want to know about it early, and we want to take timely action that ups the probability of success. And then finally, 4th, protecting the assets. Like in this work, relationship is such a precious asset. And that's both our relationship as a funder with the work and the work's relationship in its ecosystem. And so we need an approach to risk that at very least doesn't undermine those relationships, but at best is actually strengthening.
Wow, thank you so much, Shruti. That was such a lovely overview. And I love the idea of thinking about assets as relationships, first and foremost. There's so much great wisdom there, and we'll come back to Shruti as she unpacks how they really bring that mindset and approach due diligence at Chicago Beyond. But thank you so much for that wonderful overview and context. Stacy, moving on to you next, you're funding on a national level. So representing a family foundation, funding on a national level, also leaning on a lot of these reframings of how we think about risk when it comes to philanthropy. Can you share more about your work at Woodcock Foundation and how you all think about risk?
Yes, and thank you to the TBP project team for having me here. We've certainly benefited a lot from your project's resources, and I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. Woodcock's a family foundation, as you said. We have an endowment of about $80 million, so we grant about $4 million a year, which puts us at the small to mid-sized family foundation range. And we have a number of programs. Our priorities right now are democracy, an inclusive economy, and biodiversity and conservation. We have an office in New York City, but we fund across the US, and we actually do some funding internationally as well. And I just also, before going into our approach, want to just reflect on Shruti's comments. And I love this notion of suitcases, not just as negative baggage, but even the best practices we put into our baggage can sometimes, you know, become constraining and challenging despite what they're actually intended to do. And so it's a good reminder that trust-based philanthropy isn't just an opportunity to make things easier for our grantees, but also sometimes to make things easier for ourselves as funders as well. And in terms of how we think about risk at Woodcock, we do have a history of investing in pretty early stage organizations, and we focus quite a lot on leadership. So we think of the bet we're taking not just on the idea, but really being on a leader or the leaders of the organization as well. And I feel like I've been really fortunate to come into a foundation with trustees that are embracing risk as part of philanthropy. And we don't think of risk as inherently bad. Every organization faces risk. So for us, it's about understanding what are the sources of those risks, and then what the return might be in terms of social and environmental benefits that we could see from taking that risk. And then whether we can actually support a leader or organization in mitigating some of those risks. And I think one of the best ways to really understand what kind of risks you might be facing is to build a relationship and have a dialogue with the people that you're betting on. It's about trusting them, but also about creating space for them to trust you as a funder so they can feel like it's not going to be a risk for them to share the challenges they're facing, and that they can be honest about what's going well and what's not going well for them. And then we also have a rubric we use as part of our due diligence. I would say it's not just for decision making though. We try to use it as a diagnostic tool so that we can understand possible risk areas or areas that have been left developed for an organization. And then we have a capacity building budget that's separate from our core grant support budget so that we can understand what organizations are dealing with and then provide specific capacity support to help them get through a transition or to get them to the other side of a challenge. And, you know, that could include leadership coaching, board development support, communications funding, or more, depending on what an organization's looking for. And then the last thing I'll say is that we recently reconsidered what actually creates risks for nonprofits and social enterprises. And a clear risk is having leadership that doesn't really understand a problem well enough to design solutions that will solve it. And so a few years back, we added a category to our rubric that's focused on the authenticity and proximity of the leadership to the issue that that organization is addressing. Because we really believe that people who are directly impacted by issues and people who are from the communities that organizations are working in are going to be best positioned to come up with the solutions to meet those challenges. So making sure those are the leaders we're betting on is part of mitigating risk for us.
Wow, that was so great. I mean, there were so many things in there around the importance of mutuality, of relationship that can allow us to actually have the trust and transparency to hear about challenges ahead. And so much more wisdom in there that we'll come back and unpack with you, Stacey. Thank you so much for sharing that. Last but not least, wanted to bring in Minor Valise, CFO of the Headwaters Foundation. And you come from a corporate background and have brought some of that thinking as you've designed the way you think about risk at the Headwaters Foundation. Can you share more with us about Headwaters Foundation, the focus, and how you all think about risk in philanthropy?
Absolutely. Again, my name is Minor. I'm the CFO for Headwaters. We are in beautiful Missoula, Montana. If you ever get a chance in life to come here, make sure that you make an excuse to make it happen because it's beautiful. It also, I'm the more practical side of Headwaters. So if you want to talk about all the wonderful things, the loving side of Headwaters and the loving side of trust-based philanthropy, talk to my boss. Don't talk to me, okay? Talk to Brenda. She's amazing and she can inspire you about trust-based philanthropy all the time. If you want to talk about how to implement it, how to get it done, then you talk to me. And both together, we make the balance in the organization, I would say. We are a $120 million organization. We are a conversion foundation. We have been in business for now 6 years. Brenda, which is our CEO, comes for 20 years of experience in philanthropy. As Shari said, I come from corporate Fortune 500 companies, Caterpillar, and the latest one was Starbucks. I used to be the finance manager for all the drive-through business in the United States. So a lot of process improvement, a lot of like measurements, a lot of risk analysis, you name it. What do we do in Headwaters? We are trying to work in system changes. So we are really into the 0 to 5 initiative. That's what we have been working for the last 5-6 years. We're right now working and see how that strategy looks like for the next 5 to 10 years. But mainly upstream. That's our whole focus. So in system changes and also under the umbrella of trust-based philanthropy, which are the things that you're really learning about how we operate. From the risk perspective, I think for us, it requires a lot of common sense. And sometimes that's hard because that requires a lot of people on your staff to be able to understand what do you mean when we talk about risk. One of the things that we discuss a lot in this organization is innovation. It's a big thing because we run a $120 million organization with 8 people. So the only way we can be efficient is really having systems that allows us to run big processes at once. So that is an exchange is a lot of risk on that on those components. So, but from the beginning, all the way from the hiring process, we talk about different risks, and then we discuss here all the time about innovative risk, the risk that you take because you want to try something new, and if it didn't work, let's fail fast and let's fail cheap, and let's move on. What do we learn from it? Let's move on and apply it. And there is something that I always struggle with, which is the stupid risk. And that's the one that I try to emphasize with a lot of people about the stupid risk that gets under the umbrella of about being innovative, or can be also under well, we're trust-based philanthropy, right? So we can make those stupid mistakes. And I'm like, no, actually you don't. You have to evaluate before you make a decision what kind of risk are you using. So being able to coach our staff all the way from the beginning and for them to understand that everything we do, everything that we say, everything that we operate will have some kind of risk. But it's for us to always constantly measuring. Is this a risk that we're okay with it? Is a risk that we're willing to work on it? It becomes really crucial. And especially for me, focusing on that risk that is unnecessary risk. How do you educate your team and your organization to understand what is the difference between innovative risk, trust-based philanthropy-based risk, and what is a stupid risk? And how do we avoid the stupid risk? And a perfect example that I give them all the time, because again, everything that we do is risk, not only with your grantees, but the way how you process, like how you do your business, right? And the people that will go to jail, I remind them it will be me, the CFO, and the CEO. They will not go to jail. So I have to always trust them in the process that they understand what we mean when we say risk. So, but let me give you a perfect example of how a conversation that's really simple, but it has been really impactful for us when it comes to how do you behave in an organization. And a perfect example is even when you are submitting your expenses, right? You go on a trip and you submitted your expenses. Are you comfortable if you have to go and explain that expense in front of a judge in the community? Yeah, just assess your risk from that perspective. Yeah, you can have a glass of wine, but you bought a $120 bottle of wine just for you and another person? Seriously, is that how you think we should be using the resources? If you can defend it, great for you. I want to learn the elevator pitch that you have for that, but I don't. So right away there, people start testing those boundaries, right, with the daily work that they do. And obviously that translates on the way we operate. And I will tell you more about it, specific examples, how we do it here, because I also understand that one of the things that we advocate a lot in trust-based philanthropy is the relationship-based, the talking to people. And sometimes some organizations will be like, I don't have capacity to be talking to 120 people. I don't have capacity to talking to 200 people. I will tell you how we have been able to do the risk assessment in a big batch that allows us to process a lot of grants without necessarily having the extensive conversation in the front, but that mitigates the risk and allows you to be compliant not only with the IRS, but with your auditors and with your 990.
Thank you so much. We're getting a good question I want to bring back, because Shruti, both you and Minor brought up this notion. Shruti, you mentioned avoiding bad risk and embracing good risk. Minor, you're talking about, stupid risks versus good risks. I'm wondering if both of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Shruti, can just reflect on how do you distinguish between the two? What is it? What is a good risk and what is a bad risk? What is the process of navigating that? And we'll start with you, Shruti, and we'll come back to you, Minor.
Sure. I think it really starts with the intention of what you're trying to do. So we at Chicago Beyond, I think maybe a little bit like Stacy, what you were describing, are really trying to kind of fund a new generation of leaders, a new generation of perspectives, and people who haven't had access to significant resources before. And so if you start with that intention, then, things that are connected to previous access to financial resources, that is going to have a ripple effect in what your organizational infrastructure looks like. That is going to have a ripple effect in what your financial health may look like. Probably, right? Anything is possible, but if you kind of look at the probabilities, you're going to see a range of kinds of organizations. And so if we then start using that as, a disqualifier in a diligence process, or as a factor in a risk assessment that then is determining the size of the grant award, then we're effectively factoring in what we're trying to do as our intention as a disqualifier in our process, right? And so I think it's really coming back to that intention and saying, where are things causally linked to this, or, causally linked to the root cause of this, and saying, how do we really open up our diligence process, our risk process, to actually embrace what we are trying to embrace. And then, on the flip side of, the risk we don't want to take, again, it is very, I think, relationship based, but, we end up hearing from community members, often, a long time before it is, hitting the news, or, about financial mismanagement, about the things that, as Minor was pointing out, might be, illegal practice or might be bad practice. And it actually ends up giving us, I think, much better quality information earlier about those things, while giving us a clearer view of the things we want to embrace, because they line up, again, to the intention. And I think it gets us out of that muddle where we're just trying to say, we need to look at the financials and we need to examine them for X, Y, Z, and that's it. Because that actually is sort of doing neither, right? It's neither protecting us very effectively from the bad risk, nor is it, and then it's defining out of our possibility a lot of things we do want to be doing. I know, over to you.
Yeah, Minor, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think it depends. It depends. That's the hard part about this model, trust-based philanthropy, that has so many gray areas, right? Like, it's about the relationship, it's about people, it's about it's not black and white. And I think that's what is hard about this model. When it's black and white, you have policies and procedures, it's simpler. But in this case, with trust-based philanthropy allows you with you are in this spectrum where you'll be able to work. So a perfect example, when I'm saying, like, how do you define what is stupid risk or not? Let me give you maybe the example that comes to my mind is, I know that my board is a local board that's well known by the people in the community. So a perfect example is that when we are funding anything related to policy that can backfire, or somebody might see that as being political, that's the only time we bring up an idea of like to the board to have an opinion about our grants. Otherwise, everything has been approved from the beginning as a working plan. So for us, like it would be stupid for us to showcase with a policy that might look completely against what the government of Montana is doing, the state of Montana is doing, right? And then suddenly Headwaters now is in the news, and now we have to solve for that. And the board was not aware that that can have that kind of repercussion. So that's a perfect example for me of being like a stupid risk. Like we shouldn't be like, if not everybody in the organization is aligned to make this investment that might have this blowback into us and are willing to take it, then don't do it. So it's always a constant assessment. And that goes back to what we're saying when you talk to your employees. Again, like if they're going to go out and you want to have a good time because you're in a conference and you want to go and have a nice dinner, great, have a nice dinner, but don't build everything to a foundation, right? So that would be a stupid risk for me. Like you bring a $300 bill for you because you had a fantastic dinner. That would not be acceptable in our community. That would be not acceptable in our foundation, right? So, but you bring me the bill and be like, hey, we spent 300, but the foundation only has to reimburse me 100 for a nice dinner, and the other 200 I put it for myself. Like that's the kind of assessment, but it's never a black and white. It's always assessing what you're doing, what you're working on. And that's what is business. And there's some business and there's some risk that you should take because it's part of doing business. Like I would love to see a report for people to say like, we lost or grants, I don't know, of $5 million that we gave, 500,000 or 200,000 grants didn't work. Like, I would love to see the report because that's part of doing business. Is you want innovation, you want your grantees to try something new, you have to be willing to put risk capital, right? But then you have agreeing what that risk capital looks like.
Thank you so much. Thanks for reminding us of this point about risk capital. And often with trust-based philanthropy, we really speak to the inherent power imbalances that exist in our sector. And when you look at it, just kind of inherently, there's a lot more power held at the philanthropy level than at the community level when it comes to resources and access to resources. So this is where we're talking about, that's that risk capital. And now I want to dig into really what this actually, like some of these due diligence processes look like in practice. And Stacy, there's a lot of interest in the chat around your decision-making rubric. And I also want to lift up that you have transitioned some of Woodcock Foundation's practices from what used to be perhaps considered more conventional to more trust-based. So can you speak to us about just that process of what did it used to look like, the way Woodcock did due diligence, and what has shifted? And then if we have time, maybe if you could share a little bit more about how you kind of go about the due diligence process with that rubric as part of that overall approach. So a lot, but I know you're ready to tackle that.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And I also just want to acknowledge that I came into the foundation with kind of a culture already in place that I would say embraced a lot of the core of what I see trust-based philanthropy as being about without having, had the nomenclature for it. And so we have shifted some of our practices thanks to having more of an understanding of what the North Star looks like and what actually works best for our grantees. But I'll talk a little bit about a mix of things we were already doing and some shifts that we made. And I noted earlier that, there has been a culture of building relationships with grantees and really making an effort to understand what their needs are and to support them. And on the front end of our due diligence process, I think this speaks to some of the myths and realities that Shanti has put in the slide earlier. We try to do whatever homework we can at the beginning before we engage directly with an organization if we don't already know them. We just, we try not to take up their time or get their hopes up before we feel like we have a sense that there's clear alignment. And so we use whatever's available, including their websites, annual reports, or other content that's, been made available online, possibly information in GuideStar profiles, and often financials are available online. And then we also sometimes will connect with other funders who we know who are supporting those organizations so that we can kind of figure out as much alignment as possible before we reach out to them. And then we, float an organization and share a little bit about it with our board to get that initial green light before we reach out. And then once we do reach out, we really rely on conversations as the core of what our due diligence process looks like. So that once we get to a point of actually asking for a proposal and asking them to put some work in, putting something together specifically for us, that we feel like there's a pretty strong likelihood that we're going to be making a grant to that organization. And then on the reporting side is really where we've made some of the biggest shifts. After really embracing trust-based philanthropy specifically last year and putting the language on our website, we also surveyed our grantees to try to get a sense of, what's working well for them, not just with us, because it's, sometimes hard even when you have some trust to ask that question specifically, but what they find works well with funders more broadly and what doesn't work well. And we got a range of responses. It wasn't, they didn't all say the same thing. And on reporting preferences in particular, some of our grantees actually really preferred to just stick with writing reports and having that written report and knowing what, having some examples of what formats could look like. And others were really happy to not have to write reports and really liked the idea of just having conversations instead. So we realized we couldn't, necessarily stick with a one-size-fits-all approach if we wanted to be responsive to our grantees after doing that survey. And we now tell them all, we put the language into our grant letters that says they can, either write a report for us if they want to, or they can just send us an annual report or a report they've written for another funder, or they can have a phone call with us around what would typically be the reporting time to have a conversation. And so that flexibility reduces the burden for some of our grantees. And it's actually also helped strengthen our relationships. I think written reports can definitely have their own benefits, but conversations can actually just really lend themselves to nuance and create space for dialogue and inquiry and a back and forth in a way that you just obviously can't get from a written report. And then I think just another piece of like the overall broader, what we're trying to aim for is getting a sense of what funders typically require of their grantees versus what's actually required from a legal or IRS perspective in terms of what those due diligence and reporting requirements look like. And if you understand that, it actually empowers you to just rethink what you actually want to collect, what's helpful for you and what isn't. And is collecting certain information from your grantees actually important enough relative to the amount of work that it's taking that organization to get it to you?
I love that final point, and I saw Shruti and Minor both nodding a lot on that point on legal requirements. So I wanted to bring you both in to just share some additional perspective on that, or anything that you want to add that's coming to mind as we talk about the legal requirements that we're looking for. Minor, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can share a little bit of our experience with Go Grants, because I think that's a great example of creating a system that allows us to do diligence in a way that's automatic or semi-automatic, if you want to call it. So Go Grants stands for General Operating Grants. And from the beginning, our CEO had an idea of how can we distribute grants to rural Montana, knowing that there's little to no staff in a lot of those nonprofits that can apply for grants. They don't have time, or they don't have the resources to fill up an application. So she's like, how do we get to those organizations that we want to support, that align with what we want to do, and give them money quickly? And then from that, we can start building a relationship. If we need to, we get to know them, whatever you want. So when she was describing that, I go to my corporate world experience, and I say, it seems to me that you want to create like what happened right now with a credit card. Say, whenever you apply for a credit card, you have to have certain personal information, but you apply pretty quickly. I say it takes a few minutes, you apply, and they tell you right away if you're going to get a credit card or not. And I say, and if you do get a credit card, then the credit card will be there by next Friday, will be in your mailbox. And she's like, can we do that? And I was like, I don't know, I don't have any idea. I'm new to philanthropy, but let's figure it out. So then again, that allows us to figure out like, hey, what is the requirements? So first thing is like, what is the legal requirements? Oh, they only have to be 501c3 based on the IRS. That's the only requirement. And they're being active. And if they're not, they're another type, then you might have to do expenditure responsibility. I'm not going to go into that right now. So we focus in the first year, be like, you have to feel 501c3. And then the second thing, the reason why a credit card can give you a approval or not right away is because they have a FICO score, right? They have your credit score. Well, we don't have that for nonprofits. So that's when the risk assessment comes. It's like, what is important to us? So can we create our own FICO score with our nonprofits? And that's how we develop that software, to be able to be like, okay, so these things are important to us. And if they can answer these questions and they fulfill those requirements, then that's the FICO score. So then let's create now a little scorecard. And they will go right away into green, approve, yellow, you might need to do a little bit more research, and red, they're unqualified based on our criteria. And that became really an easy way for us to do two things. One is the legal requirements, and second, the due diligence of does this organization align with what we want to do? And just to give you an idea. So I'm telling this to our CEO, sharing with other nonprofits locally about, like, we have this idea, we are developing this idea, we want to do a $10,000 grants. And the CEOs of a lot of the nonprofits were like, no, people are going to steal your money. That's too easy. Like, the same system, they have been teaching them that they shouldn't be getting money that easy, right? So it's like, you're going to get a scam. And my boss comes to me, he's like, hey, I'm getting this pushback from other nonprofits. And I said, well, let's do $5,000 there. And it's like, $5,000, okay? Yeah. And I said, well, listen, if 10 organizations steal total $50,000, we're giving away $500,000. That's 10%. That's normal risk. That's fine, right? Like, okay, let's do it. And we did it. And it was been a great success. And no one. And then what we did the first year is we did 60 grants. And then we visited each of those grantees in their communities. We visit them just to say hello, we are Headwaters, this is what we do. And of the 60, only one grant, we didn't renew the next year. And not because they stole the money, but it's because they didn't align exactly what we wanted to work. And that allows us to make an adjustment to the FICO score for the following year. And then really quickly I realized that if you're the scammer, you're not going to open a nonprofit, apply to IRS, get a board, get an INE number to be able to steal $5,000. There's quicker way for you as a scammer to get $5,000, right? So there's not a system. So for us, that has been a way to really move forward into the risk assessment, into what Stacey was saying also, what is really the legal requirements. We had 6 years of clean audits because we also work with the auditors from the beginning of developing this program. We work with the lawyers with the beginning of this thing. And they're coming from the conservative side. So they're saying, like, you want to do what? And then when I tell them, and then I ask them, why wouldn't I? Is there any legal that can do it? And they go like, no, they're not. It's like, so what is, so I said to my editor, what is required? And she goes, consistency. If you do it 1 year the way, you have to do it the same way the next year. And I was like, I can't do that. And then I talked to my lawyers, and my lawyer's like, well, you're right. Like, the only thing that's required 501c3, and you're already checking that because your system connects automatic to the IRS database, and they tell you if they're active or not. So it's like, so from the legal perspective, you're fine. And it's like, okay, so I'm good. And now we have a system that last year we did 80 grants. And because of that, now we have a relationship with a small little nonprofit that's run by 1 or 2 people in rural Montana. They're doing amazing work. And now they have become a more strategic partner. And because of that, now they're becoming a grantee that gets more money from us because they're doing the work that we want to do in that community.
Thank you so much, Minor. There's so much there. I want to bring you in, Shruti. I know we had brought this question to you around some of the legal requirements, but I also want to kind of do the thing that I do and tack on another question, and invite you to share a little bit about your approach at Chicago Beyond, because you have described it as mutual diligence, which I really love that way of thinking about it. Can you share with us what that means and how you approach your due diligence process at Chicago Beyond?
Sure. I mean, on the legal point, Minor said it. I mean, apart from the 501c3, there's so many things that are like these like myths and ghosts of things that are required that we, but aren't actually. And I think echoing the Headwaters experience, just to give people on this session another data point, we've done something similar with our responsive and seed funding, where, in a group of 100, again, this was out of the blue from their perspective, right? So they are not, this is on kind of community nominations, community perspectives, people benefiting from the work, saying, look, this is who's showing up for my family. This is who's showing up for me. These are the people doing the work. These are the people who've been doing the work without having any institutional funding for years. And, in 100 of those, there was, maybe one, and similar to Minor's example, it was a different kind of issue. So I think just another data point that this idea that if we just move money to people, that it's going to create all kind of risk is not actually borne out in the data in either of our experiences, at least. But in the other piece of our work, Shadi, which I think you were asking about, which is about these kind of larger multi-year partnerships for systems change. Yes, it is, we frame it as a mutual diligence process, truly not just to kind of replace the words, but, similar, I think, to Stacey's experience at the front end, we are only entering after doing the homework ourselves, right? And so we are kind of even entering into this with this idea of how do we really come in informed about what this could be. And then, the way I think that mutuality shows up, one example is, the potential partners doing reference checks on us, right? They are talking to our other partners and really learning about, what could this look like? What is this process like? The process itself is a series of 4 to 5 conversations. It's a work in progress, but often Chicago Beyond writes the materials for our board. There is no writing on the part of the potential partner, again, because we're really trying to shift that onus from organizations that may not have grant writing staff, because we don't think that should determine their access to Chicago Beyond funding. And then it is also really the start of an ongoing flow of information to action. So even in that mutual diligence process, if we're learning, government reimbursement is likely to be delayed for a mental health provider, right? And the staff are absorbing so much secondary trauma. And so those delays pose a real risk to staff well-being, to staff turnover, right? Because the organization has no other way of making payroll. Than actually us acting to say, well, Chicago Beyond can make a larger initial disbursement. So this organization now has a financial cushion. And so we actually are able to change the risk, right? Change the probability of this thing succeeding through that process. And then that builds the relationship with which we actually enter the partnership. So we really think of this mutual diligence process as one that's meant to both help us understand each other, to truly explore, is there a valuable partnership here, and to build a really strong starting point for partnership when we get to that point.
There's a question coming up around just the staff capacity to do this kind of relational due diligence approach. And I want to bring it both to you, Shruti, and Stacey. And maybe we'll start with you, Stacey, because your team, you have a team of about 2.5 staff, I believe. So how do you manage that? Because this is a question that often comes up, that it can be very time consuming to do this relational, due diligence. So can you share more about how you manage that and how you make space for that?
Sure. Yes, I do have a team of 2.5 people, including me. So we're very leanly staffed. I think the main reason it works for us is that our grants are relatively large and often multi-year, large relative to our size. A lot of other funders with, similar assets are making a lot of small grants. Our typical grants are around 100,000 plus annually. You know, it can range from 25,000 to 250 a year, but that could be, you know, a 4-year $1 million grant. And because we have long-term relationships and are not you know, don't have as many grantees as we would if we were making a lot of $10,000 to $20,000 grants, it does give us the space and capacity to build and strengthen those relationships over time. And in any given year, because of the multi-year trajectory of our relationships, we're really only engaging with a handful of new organizations.
Shruti or Minor, would you like to offer some perspective on this question?
Couple of little things I can sprinkle in. You know, I think one, it's important to think about what we're not doing by virtue of a trust-based approach. So I think there's a lot of energy that can go into reporting and managing paper and that we are not doing. And so I think that actually frees up a lot of time to do this. So that's the first thing. The second thing is similarly, you know, we do make substantive multi-year grants. And so, you know, this isn't a question of like, you know, 1,000 small grantees that we're trying to be in a relationship all at once. So that helps. And then the third thing I'll say is for our more responsive and seeding work, you know, truly relying on community, whether it's through formal structures like our People's Assembly, whether it's through existing partners, you know, truly relying on these networks of trust. Because then, you know, we stop thinking of it as like, you know, Chicago Beyond's the center and we have to have like a one-on-one relationship with each thing, but more saying like, how do we become a participant in an ecosystem? And then there's sort of many things that come out of that might all be responsive work that we're supporting, you know, but it has its own ecosystem that we're participating in as opposed to feeling like I individually need to have an individual relationship with 100 different people, because honestly, from their perspective, they have work to do every day. They don't have time to have individual relationships with 100 funders either.
That's exactly right. Minor, did you want to share more on this? There's a few more questions I want to get to, but I want to make space for your thoughts.
I think this system will not work if the other components of the organization are not working. So let me share with you the analogy that I have. It might not be a good analogy, but let me share you the analogy that I use all the time. A traditional philanthropy approach is that we have these dinosaurs that are the boars, right? And they're required to be fed constantly. So you have a lot of stuff, and what they do all the time is go into the bamboo fields, cutting bamboo, and bring it with their hands and give it to the board, right? That's why you have a lot of stuff writing decks, all the applications that you get for your grants. You're prepping how you're going to convince the board that that grant should be approved. So you have a lot of program stuff like consume hours and hours trying to serve the board or the internal processes. So with us, we just have an annual plan, and the annual plan gets approved at the beginning of the year or the end of the year, the previous year. So we know what we're working on. And the board knows that we're working in those specific categories. We are in charge of finding the partners that's going to help us do the work. So then at that moment, these hours that typically philanthropy will spend trying to cut the bamboo and bring the bamboo back and everything, we don't have to. So you have more time to be in the forest. You have more time to discover the forest. You have more time to relax in the forest. So that's the only reason this works. If you ask me, how can I do this relationship based, but then the back processes are the same, you're crazy. You have to hire double your staff.
Love it. So we're getting a lot of questions in the chat that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to everything, but I want to note that there's also a lot of collective wisdom among our people listening in today too. And I love the responses that folks are giving and your own experiences. And I hope if we don't get to your question today or here, that you'll stick around for the discussion portion where you can engage with other colleagues and hear their experiences, because there's a lot of collective wisdom in this room. So I want to get to this question around this notion of like, how do you deal with like organizations that might feel risky? This is a question that we get often of like, how do you find the right orgs to fund, like the ones that deserve the trust, which is of course kind of counter to what trust-based is all about. However, this is a real question that maybe boards might ask or it might come up. And so I wanted to invite all of you to just share some examples, or maybe a couple of you, because we can move on to a couple other questions also. And maybe Stacey, we'll come back to you. You mentioned that you do some international funding. I know sometimes questions come up around funding internationally. What are the ways to do that in a kind of risk-averse way? And I believe Woodcock has also done some funding of C4s. So can you share with us like how you and I don't know, you can use those examples or other examples, but how have you navigated the terrain when there's something that could be perceived as a risky investment?
Sure. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things we do is try to help organizations mitigate risk with capacity building support. And I think, that's a way that you can actually try to have a response of how can we help you do this instead of we can't do this because it feels too risky. In terms of the actual approaches to the type of grant making, both in international and C4 grant making, there's a specific legal process called expenditure responsibility that you can go through. And it's actually, it's a paperwork process. It requires a specific set of kind of due diligence, but it's actually pretty aligned with what a lot of organizations would probably be doing anyway. And it actually creates more flexibility in what you can fund and who you can fund and what they can do with that funding. On the international front, that applies if it's an organization that doesn't have 501c3 status. And to the point earlier that, the main legal requirement for a funder is that they have a C3. That's generally true, but you actually can still go around that by establishing equivalency through this expenditure responsibility process. I'm happy to share a resource with Shanti SMU to share around if others are interested in what that looks like. But essentially, I worked with our lawyers to have a template for what that process looks like, and they're comfortable with me using it because we've done it enough times that I'm comfortable with it now. And it's really come into play with C4 grant making in the past year for us, with democracy being a newer program area for us, and with Woodcock being a leaner funder. We saw an opportunity to try to kind of increase the catalytic value of our grant dollars by putting them into C4 entities. And when we do that, they're still actually restricted to the same purposes as C3, but they increase the budget that C4 entities can raise for their democracy work that has other purposes. And so it's a way for us to go through a little bit more paperwork ourselves and then free our grantees up a little bit more to raise money to do things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to fund.
That's really helpful. We got a pretty granular question, but could you unpack a little bit what is expenditure responsibility for those who may not be aware?
Yeah, it's essentially an effort to establish that for the IRS, that an organization is going to use the funds you give them for something that would be the equivalent of 501c3 purposes based on how the IRS defines it. So essentially, if you can say, we collected, this list of documents from the organization, we understand enough about what they're doing, and this is the specific impact we understand they're having, and that's what they're using our dollars for, then you can outline all of that into an agreement that you both sign, and you're allowed to make a grant through that process to an organization that doesn't actually have 501c3 status. And there's a website called Learn Foundation Law that has a whole module on expenditure responsibility. That's fantastic. If anyone is interested in learning more about the process and figuring out how to use it at their foundation, I highly recommend that module.
Great recommendation. We'll make sure to include that in our follow-up resources for the session. I'm so sad to say we're getting really short on time for our panel discussion, and I want to bring in 2 additional questions. And one is really specifically, and you alluded to this, Minor, and actually Stacey and Shruti also did allude to this as well. This idea or the question around how do we work with legal teams and auditors and our tax consultants to do this work in a trust-based way? And what are some ways to approach those relationships, not as like, we're up against these people, we're working against them, but we're actually working collaboratively. And I know all three of you have some really interesting insights about how to approach those relationships so that you can do this work actually in a more trust-based way. So I don't know, I guess I'll just kind of open it up with you, Minor, and then we'll invite Shruti and Stacy to share any additional reflections. How do you work with your legal and tax teams to do this work?
And I think what is important to us is that we apply trust-based philanthropy in everything that we do. So our vendors, we have the relation with our vendors. And I can tell you so many stories about us remodeling this building where I'm at right now, where the construction company, from the beginning, we told them how we operate and how we wanted to work with them. And I can tell you amazing stories about how that transformed the way we work with them. But when it comes to risk, you have to understand that from the beginning, you have to understand your CFOs, your lawyers, your auditors, they get paid to minimize risk. They don't get paid to be innovative. None of us get, like, we're not in this position because we invented something cool. We are in this position because we make sure the debits and credits are correct. We make sure that all the law has been cited and reviewed. And the auditors make sure that you're not doing anything innovative there, that you use traditional accounting and you're following GAAP. So from the beginning, you have to understand that that is a world. We come from a world of like status quo, and risk averse is the norm, is the key, right? So if you understand that and you bring them really early on to try to bring solutions rather than like trying for them to solve it for you, you just come with scenarios and then try to work with them to be like, this is what I'm trying to do. This is how I'm going to go about it. Do you see anything here that should be aware of? I'm not asking for permission, yes or no. I'm just bringing you an idea about how I want to go at this. And if you're finding something that can be an issue, just let me know. And then I will try to mitigate for that. So that has been really effective for us. Also, we do it early. None of those individuals like surprises. So bring them early and be like having a conversation. And it's a conversation. You're not changing anything. Like you just want to have a conversation about this process that you're thinking about.
That's great. One final question for all three of you is really for those who are listening in, really liking what they hear, but perhaps are coming from a more traditional, conventional organization that is not doing much trust-based at all. What is your advice on opening the conversation about reframing risk and thinking about due diligence in a more trust-based way? What's one thing or one way that others can start that conversation internally? And we'll just go around and we'll start with you, Stacy, then Shruti, then Minor.
Sure. I think there are a couple of questions that you can just ask as you're considering the practices you use. And one is, are those practices and processes that you're using still serving you and your grantees? And would you do them the same way if you built them from scratch today? I also think just in anything you're doing, if you're questioning if it's the right thing to do, the list of principles is great, but you also can just ask, is doing this likely to build trust in my relationship with a grantee or not? And then I think following that rule of thumb of like revisiting, are you asking your grantees for things that you're not really actually even using to inform your processes? Or could you be asking for something different and easier for them to provide that will just as well be able to contribute to your decision-making process? And then finally, just ask your grantees what works for them.
Great advice. Minor and then Shruti.
I always tell people, I remember I just told you I come from Caterpillar and Starbucks, right? So in Starbucks, I'm trying to do whatever I can to wow you as a customer. That way you come back and buy more expensive coffee that takes me 50 cents to make it and you buy it for $5, right? That's my goal, right? So then think about that relationship on the opposite side. My dream is one day for grantees to have so much power that they get to pick which foundations to work with. So now they're doing due diligence on you, right? So think about that for a second. So then you care about equity, you care about DEI. I would say the majority say yes. This is a term, like when you start looking at this term from that lens, my due diligence, there's nothing more than me judging people or judging organizations based on things that they might not know how to do. It's not that they're bad people, right? And why am I taking the risk on this? So I think for me, it's extremely important that you see that relationship as, are we working with this nonprofit? They're the one doing the work. I'm in a fancy chair in a fancy office. They are dealing with the issues of the community. Like, so to me, it's like, we should be looking ourselves about, like, if you do a due diligence in me as a funder, would you be doing business with me? And I think many of us will not get a lot of businesses.
Yeah, I love the flip of that power dynamic. Thank you, Minor. Shruti, final words of advice for those who want to get moving on this trust-based journey.
Yeah, I think two things. One, being out in community close to the work, and I'm saying that for everybody, so not just the program officer, but truly everybody. I think that not only is it just a joyful experience, but it just clarifies things, and just a lot of things that take up so much energy just drop away and become clearly irrelevant. And a lot of other things start feeling a lot more imperative. You see people in different roles kind of saying, wait a second, we got to change this, right? Because they are feeling something, they are seeing something themselves firsthand. So I think one, just being in the presence of the work, which has a whole bunch of other benefits also. And then two, being conscious of these power dynamics, not just, out there, but also in here within our own institutions, right? A lot of this, I think, friction that can start to feel very personal, where you have people in program roles who are like, well, I'm trying to be trust-based, and don't people understand like what's going on the ground, right? And then you have people in finance roles being like, well, I'm trying to, I live in the real world and I'm trying to not get this thing shut down by the, it can go in this very like self-righteous direction, which actually creates more power dynamics, right? And so coming back to the essence of saying, truly, how do we collectively behave as a leadership, actually getting invested in shared purpose, and then in the micro practices day to day, like in those moments where it's so tempting to create a new power dynamic, to create a new us versus them, to instead lean in and build a bridge and to say, this person has a vantage point, and this person has, we need the legal perspective, we need the finance perspective, we need the accounting perspective, we need the community perspective, and we need to work as though we understand that it is our duty to get these collective things to pull towards what will get to freedom for people, as opposed to expending all of our energy. So I think it's both those get out in community, and then in those micro choices we're making every day, not letting ourselves create more power dynamics.
Beautifully put. Everyone, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel, Shruti Jayaraman, Chief Investments Officer at Chicago Beyond, Stacy Fiella, Executive Director of the Woodcock Foundation, and Minor Valise, CFO of the Headwaters Foundation. We are so grateful to you for sharing your insights and perspectives and really giving us a deeper look into how to do trust-based due diligence. And I hope for others you will stick around. If you had a question that didn't get answered, please stay and discuss with peers. There's a lot of wisdom in this room. I'm going to hand us back to Shantias to guide us to the next session. And thank you again to our fabulous panelists. Take care.
Yes, thank you so much. I echo those sentiments of gratitude. What a wonderful conversation. And I see my colleague putting it in the chat. I know a few people do need to drop off, but please do fill out the survey before you hop off if possible. We still have more to discuss, but before we do, I do want to take us through a few key takeaways. I know there were so many gems that were dropped, and we'll continue to talk about them in this next portion. But just some key takeaways to reiterate from our conversation. a trust-based due diligence process really looks at redefining risk, thinking about it from a mutual consideration, thinking about risk to the community, risk to the nonprofit, thinking about those implications on communities, playing that other perspective, prioritizing that other perspective. A trust-based approach really moves from scrutinizing organizations and thinking about what's wrong with this organization's issues, and thinking about it from a deficit mindset to a deeper asset-based approach. What are their assets? How can I support them? What impact are they making? And how can I bolster that? A trust-based approach can foster better risk management. We've talked about how when you're in deep relationship with your grantees, they're more likely to share what's going on, to share what's wrong, and to help you mitigate it, to help you support it and respond to it in a really responsive way. And then a trust-based funder takes on that onus of risk, understanding that funders are in the position of power in this dynamic and have more risk that they can take on, and it won't negatively affect them as much as your grantee partners. And this happens both in the process, doing the homework, doing the research, not asking for things that you're not going to use, but then also in the response and how you respond to the perceived risk itself. So those are just some of the key takeaways. I know there are more. We'll continue this conversation. But before we jump into that, I mentioned the closing poll. Would love for you all to take a second to do this poll. Now that we've had this conversation, there's been so much discussion, both through our panelists in the chat, so many things we shared, and we're going to continue this conversation. But how confident are you now that you can answer this question with more detail? How do we approach risk and due diligence? I know there's still a lot of questions. I'm really thinking about part 2 to this because clearly there's so much more that we need to talk about here. And I appreciate all of your engagement. I'm seeing a lot more people are very confident now, which is great. And I think a lot more people are somewhat confident as well. I'm seeing a good amount of that too. There's still a need for more clarity, and we hear you. We'll keep having this conversation. So yeah, let me go ahead and end this poll. Thank you for those of you that responded, and I'll just share that. We have about 40% that are very confident now, which, how many did we have at first? Like 3% maybe? And then we have about 59% that are somewhat confident, and then 1% that are not confident. So we'll keep having this discussion. Deeply appreciate all of your engagement. I think my colleague already put the evaluation link in the chat, but please do submit that. And now we're going to jump into some discussions. As I mentioned before, we have some lovely PSO partners that are going to be leading discussion. If you want to stay in the main room, that's also an option. We'll be having discussion there too, learning from each other, hearing from your peers, reflecting on what you heard. Yeah, and the resources and the recording will be shared out within a week. You'll have the recording, the slide deck, some of the resources that were mentioned. We're going to try to address some of the questions. I've been capturing all of those. And so, yeah, we'll do that. And then please do join us at our next session. What does grantee accountability look like? So this first session was talking about that due diligence process, the pre-grant process. And then once you've gotten through the grant, we get a lot of questions on, okay, if I'm trust-based, does that mean I just expect them to do whatever and I don't have any accountability? And what if they don't do what they say they're going to do? So we'll be tackling that as well from a trust-based approach on June 14th. So we look forward to seeing you there. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and pause now to stop the recording.